In this video, we'll take a look at the next steps on how to take our terrain created from Gaea, or really any terrain produced from a height map, and clean up some of the vertical stretched areas that we see here. And you'll get this with height maps because height maps only define height, so anywhere where there's really a 90-degree angle or something close to it, we end up with these stretched geometries, and we're going to take a look at how we can fix those areas. Now there's many ways you can do this, and I actually find ZBrush or Houdini a great tool to deal with these areas, but we'll be doing this in Blender since it's a much more accessible software, and we can actually make a geometry node network that we can reuse to easily fix these areas. But before we jump into that, let's take a look at what our end result will be like. So just as an example, if we were to produce some terrain assets in Gaea and export them out as a mesh and bring them into Unreal as nanite meshes, we might end up with something like this, where we have a lot of faces that have these stretched issues from being generated from height maps, and cleaning those up can be a little bit tedious. So we're going to go over a quick way we can deal with that using a geometry node network in Blender, and we'll be able to take something like this and actually produce something that looks like this instead, where all those areas that were stretched start to become a lot more detailed, and we no longer have as much of an issue for those areas that have very steep slopes. So to go through this process, we're going to have to export our geometry from Gaea. And to do that, I'm just using a mesher node here, and I'm right now just exporting 2048 by 2048, so less detail than what we see here, just because I want to run through the process fairly quickly. And you can save it as quads, but if you save it as triangles adaptive, it'll probably save out a little bit more efficiently because it will try to cut down some of the polygons and not produce as dense or as heavy of a mesh. So that might be something you want to do as well. And you really just want to write out your terrain to an OBJ format here, or whatever format you want to use, and then also write out maybe a normal map, your textures, and all the other stuff that you might want to use. But that's going to be the first step of this process. Export your terrain to an OBJ, and once you have that, we're going to load that up in Blender. So once you have your terrain exported from Gaea and imported into Blender, we can see that there's these stretched faces for a lot of the vertical areas. And we're going to take a look at how we can clean that up building a geometry node network. So we're going to go to our geometry nodes tab, and we can go to our mesh here and add a modifier for geometry nodes, or we can just click new. And now we have our geometry nodes, and this is our input, that's our output, so let's disconnect this for now. And we want to select those very steep vertical areas that have those stretched faces. So an easy way we can do this is take our geometry node here, connect it to a separate geometry node, and we're going to separate geometry nodes based on this selection here. And we're not going to separate the points, we're going to separate the faces, or select the faces based on a condition, and that condition is going to be, I'll add a node, a normal node, so I can just press Shift A to open up our node search, and I can just search a node called normal, and I'll take the normals of the faces, separate XYZ, and I'm going to take the Z channel and connect that to a greater than. And this will allow me to compare that normal angle to a value here, a float value. And I could say if that float value is greater than 0.5, then use that as a selection. So if I do that and we look at the output, now we have all those vertical areas selected that have all the stretching problems. And if we change this value here for B, we'll be able to expand that selection or shrink that selection. So now we can easily mask out all those stretched vertical and steep areas of our height map geo. So that's the first part. So now that we have those areas selected or isolated, we want to be able to fix up those problematic areas, those stretched areas. So what we're going to do now is take this selection, and we're not just going to output it, we're going to connect it to a distribute points on faces. And we're going to scatter a ton of points all over these problematic stretched areas or these stretched faces. So I'm going to scatter maybe 2 million points, but you might want to start with smaller numbers because this will get slow. But I'll scatter a ton of points randomly on those faces and then turn those points into geometry or to mesh. Mesh to points. I want points to volume, and then we'll have to go from a volume to a mesh. So volume to mesh. And we'll have to set up some settings here as well. So what I'm going to do is for the points to volume, I probably want to make the voxel amount really small. And again, start with bigger numbers first, because the smaller you go, the slower it's going to be. So let's set some of those things up, and maybe threshold 0.3. And I'll connect this to the output and see what we get. So do we see anything? We do not. So let's see if we need to change some of these values or if this is working. We scatter points. Okay, we get all those points. Points to volume. Looks like we get a volume and then volume to mesh. Now let's see if my threshold is too high. And oh, I see an issue here. So actually we're not getting a volume because I have resolution set to amount. I'm going to set it to size, very small size. And now let's try this. 0.3, I'm going to do 0.003. There we go. Okay. So it just wasn't small enough. So now we're starting to get all the stretched areas and kind of remesh them into these blobs. And we can make these blobs smaller or larger. We have voxel size, so we might have to go really small on that, but I think 0.003 should be good enough. And then a radius is how big these blobs are. And you want enough overlap, because if they're too small, you're going to get a lot of cuts and slices and problems in between. So I find 0.005 in this case is pretty good because it's sealing up all those gaps and areas. So we get all these vertical stretched areas to now be these remeshed blobs that have slightly better topology or geometry. And after that, we could, if we want, to subdivide this. So we could add like a subdivide mesh node to even give it a bit more geometry. Like if I were to look at the wireframe, we could set this to level 2 and add more tessellation, more geometry here to give it more detail, which might be important later when we start displacing it with some textures or procedurals. So maybe for now, leave that really low so it's quick. And then as you need more detail, you can start pushing that up. So we'll add that there as like a quality level type thing. And that's now taking all those areas and giving us better geometry to work with. So that's kind of the next step. And what we're going to have to do now is combine this back with our terrain, because like our ground or the areas that we're not modifying are totally gone right now. So we want to add that stuff back. So I'm just going to create another separate geometry node. And I do this so we can control what pieces we keep of the ground and what pieces we keep of the vertical areas. So I'm just going to create another separate geometry node and just copy and paste another greater than node and connect it up pretty much the same. But now we'll just use a different value to specify what part of the ground we want to keep. So I'll connect this geometry, separate geometry selection. If I connect that up to our output, we see this again, but instead I'm going to do the inverted selection. So now we're just keeping the ground only, and I'll be able to modify this to define kind of how much I want to keep of that ground. And maybe I'll just put it at 0.6. And for the other area that's more vertical and stretched, let's take a look at how much I'm keeping there. Maybe I'll do a little bit of overlap. I'll put that 0.4. That way we don't get gaps in between. And I'll combine both of these together just to make sure there's no gaps or anything. So I'll take this, and then what I'll do is I'll add like a join geometry node and add the inverted of that other separate geometry. And if we look at all this combined, now we'll get the ground and those remeshed vertical areas. So our full node network looks something like this. And we start to see we got the ground that we've kept, and then these vertical areas we've kind of remeshed. And if I don't like that, I can start changing these. Like I could say, okay, 0.5 for those vertical areas, and then 0.7 for the ground. And you can find like a good balance between the two. Just make sure there's no gaps or slices in between the terrain and those more vertical areas. So this is okay. And if we look at our terrain now, okay, it looks a little bit odd that we have all that stuff going on, really lumpy. And again, you can adjust these settings and produce better results. We might have to play around with it a bit, but for now, this should work. So what's next? Now we have to start adding some detail to this new remeshed geometry for these more vertical areas. So I'm going to create a little bit of a kind of procedural texture here. I'm just going to go in here and Shift A, search, and I'm going to create a wave texture. And we can play around with this. I'm sure if you spend some time with it, you'll find a way to be able to combine multiple procedural textures and produce a really nice looking kind of rock face or something on some of your terrains. You could even load in textures that you've done in Photoshop or other softwares as well. But for now, I'm just going to do this as a simple example. I'm going to use a wave texture. We'll change some of these settings once we apply it and see what we need to do. But I'll take the output here and I'll connect that to a multiply. So take that output, connect it to a multiply it by the normals. So it pushes out the surfaces here based on the normal of the face of vertice. And then I will multiply that by another value, which will kind of be the strength. And what I actually want to do is make sure I don't just multiply by a single value here. I just added a multiply, but what I actually want is a multiply vector. So vector math multiply. And that's important. And I'm going to do it again, vector math multiply. They have X, Y, Z here. And again, I'm going to have to change these once I connect it up and see what it does. But pretty much we're just going to take a texture, push it out based on the normals by a certain amount, and this will be our strength. And then what we're going to do is also add, vector math add a value as like an offset as well for if we need to shift things a little bit, shift things down, shift things up, whatever we might have to do. And then to make this affect our areas that we've remeshed here, we're going to do a set position node, and we're going to take the offset and connect that to this little network here that we made, the wave procedural, and then connect that up as the new output to join our geometry together with. So I'm just going to disconnect that, reconnect it. Okay, so you don't see much yet, but if we look at our node network now, and I have this wave texture here, I'm going to zoom into that, and we're going to start playing around these settings and see if we can get a lot more detail on these faces. So I'll start off with the scale here, and right now, scale of 5, try scale of 2, 200. So you can see things are changing, but not much, because we have to probably multiply it by a stronger value. So I'm going to multiply it by maybe really small numbers at first just to see what happens. It depends on the scale of your geometries. But I'll do negative 0.003 for X, negative 0.003 for Y, and same thing for Z. And you can see how now it's shifting this and kind of doing a push in based on the strength of this texture and kind of what this texture is doing. So we'll probably have to play around with this bit just to see good values that give us a lot of detail. And I might have to also increase my subdivision of my mesh here so we have more geometry on the faces to add detail to. So I'll set that to level 2. And maybe I'll go through here and just start changing some of these settings. So distortion, sure, let's really break up this terrain and add a lot of distortion. Detail, let's add more detail. Let's put that to 8. There we go. Now we're getting a lot more breakup. Detail scale, sure, let's make that bigger as well, see what happens. So you can play around with this and start getting more breakup, more detail added in here. Strength, not always more is better. Sometimes you just want to keep it subtle so it doesn't look like a ton of noise. So I could probably adjust these as well and see if maybe going with less intensity is going to give me a better result. And I think that's already starting to look better. And then if you look at the base of these areas that we're retouching now by adding all these extra details, sometimes you get these lumps at the base. I'm sure you could find clever ways to taper it off around the bottom here using like a mask or something. But another cheap way of just being able to solve this problem for now is I'm just going to offset all these details just negative 0.003 and just push it down. And there you go. That might help. And already it's starting to look a lot better. We have our ground, and now all these vertical faces have been kind of remeshed and kind of deformed or displaced with a procedural texture. And this is where you want to spend a little bit of time, and you'll be able to find a really good recipe that gives you a good amount of detail. But even what I've done here in just a couple minutes is already looking a lot better than it originally did. So it's already kind of a little bit of a success here compared to what it was before. So you want to play around with that, see what you can get, but already we have our node network made here, our geometry node network, that can already kind of take any vertical stretched areas, remesh them, and add details. We probably also want to see what this looks like with our textures applied to it, so I'm just going to go to the shading node, create a new material, and connect up our exported texture. So I'm just going to go in here and connect the base color to an image texture and open up our exported texture from Gaea. So once we click that open dialog, we'll pretty much be able to browse to our file. So I'm going to take my 2D texture combined here, open that image, and it will load it in onto our geometry. And if we take a look at it, so I'm just going to take a look at it here, it's like, okay, it works for, looks like it's kind of working. We get a color, but there's no detail. Everything's kind of broken. And that's because a lot of our UVs are probably lost or completely gone after doing this remeshing. So we need to be able to get that all back. And there's a lot of ways, again, you can do this, but I think one of the easiest things we could do is just reproject our texture back onto this new terrain using a projection method in Blender, and that will just create us some new UVs. And UVs for height mapped geometry is really straightforward because it's really just like a planar projection, a top-down projection for the UVs. So it's not hard to get back if we lose them. So I'm going to go over how we'll be able to do that next to get our UVs back and see what this terrain looks like with our proper textures applied. So I'm just going to go back to the Layout tab, and here I'll turn on textures so we can see what's happening, or turn on shading. And I'm just going to create a grid, so just like a plane, so mesh, grid, there it is. And we just want to make sure it's the same size as our terrain here. So I can modify this manually by just selecting the points and faces, or just resizing it, rescaling it. It doesn't really matter how you do this, as long as we get it to roughly match the size of our terrain here. So probably the easiest thing for me is like looking at this is just like 4 times too big. So I could just set the scale to 0.25, and we'll have something that's, oh, maybe a little bit bigger in 0.25, 0.5, my bad. 0.5, and it's pretty much the same size as our terrain here. And you probably want to match it up really accurately, but I'm just going to eyeball it for now, just to show you kind of how we'll be able to do this. So now that we have this plane that's matched up to the same size as this, it's really easy. We're just going to go back to our terrain here that we created with the geometry node network. I'm going to go into the modifiers, and on our modifiers, we're going to add a new one called UV project. And once we add that UV project modifier, the object I want to project from is going to be this plane or this grid that we created. So I drop that as the object. And as soon as I've done that, we can see that now if I move this plane, it moves these projected textures that we see. So as long as we have this grid nicely aligned and floating above this geometry, which is our terrain, everything will kind of just project into place. So you just want to make sure that's matching up really closely. If it's offset like I currently have right now, we're going to have a little bit of a problem. So what I'll do is since I'm eyeballing this for now, I'm just going to bring that grid down. And I could probably disable my UV projection node while doing this because it will be slow because it is a lot of geometry. And I'll just take this plane here, the grid, and match that up nicely. So I'll go in here and I might even just take that projection away from the grid just so it's not slow. And there we go. I can see how I had it offset here. I'm just going to match it up. And again, you can do this much better. I'm just going to do this to kind of get the point across that it's something you can do to reproject the UVs. So that's much better lined up now. I can turn that UV project back on. I drop this plane again, and we end up with our projected textures. Now we don't see it on our remeshed areas here, and that's because I have to assign this material to all of my new geometry. So in the geometry node network that we have here, I'm actually going to go and add, after I join the geometry, I'm going to do a material, set material node, and set the material to that material that we have, that we created. And now it gets assigned to all that geometry. And we can see that now we have our remeshed rock faces with the texture reprojected back on. And you might want to fix those textures, like they're still stretching textures, but at least we have geometry now that's not stretching. But technically you could also assign a separate different material for the vertical areas and put on a texture that doesn't have stretched information and that you kind of create that's more like a rock cliff or something, or some mega scans or something. But for now, I'm just going to use the same color texture. And with the geometry breakup that we've added, it should be enough to add sufficient detail to it. But there's a lot of other things you can do to improve it even further. So this is kind of what we end up with now. We've fixed our stretched geometry and have much more detailed geometry for those areas now. So next I just added in some simple lighting. I have one light here and did a couple more adjustments, but for the most part it's pretty much the same as what we created. We still have the stretch textures, but at least we have the geometry now with more detail. And I'm just going to do a quick render of this. So I'm going to change my render engine here to have it set to cycles, and I'll turn on our kind of preview render here. And let's see what this new terrain looks like with those additional details added. So now already, if we zoom up to some of these areas, they're not perfect. We could improve them further. But they look a whole lot better than having a bunch of stretched faces. So already we're getting a better result, but you might have to play around with it a little bit more. But even from far away, even from close, we're getting a much more improved geometry on those areas. So this is kind of how we can start to add detail to our height map meshes, which have those issues of stretched faces. This is useful for taking a height map geometry, producing something that's higher quality out of it, or even using modular assets that you're creating, environment assets from height maps, and how you can touch up those areas and start producing something much higher quality that's kind of more similar to what you'd get out of a scanned geo from photogrammetry or a LiDAR scan. But now we can start to take this and bring this into Unreal and get much better detail out of our terrains from Gaea or from any software that generates terrains based on height maps. And now just jumping back to our geometry only without the textures, just to see kind of the difference. We get a lot more detail here. Again, this could be improved further. You could also maybe mask some other areas where you don't want our remeshing to happen. Like we get these little blobs and chunks here and there that we might not really want to have. So those things you could probably mask away as well. But this gives us a great way to start adding more detail. And we'll go over the next steps of where this will lead up to. Pretty much what our goal is going to be is we're going to be able to create a lot of reusable, detailed assets from Gaea and run them through Blender to kind of do this remeshing process on areas that are low detail. We're going to be able to upgrade the textures, and we'll be able to build ourselves a library of more higher quality environment assets that we could scatter throughout our terrains in Unreal, in Blender, in any software where you're creating a 3D environment. So that's kind of the goal of what we're doing here. And then also if you're just wanting to use height map terrain for a background or something and you don't like those stretched faces, this is a way you can get around that as well. So that's the things that we're going to be taking a look at next, but hopefully this gives you an easy way to fix up those areas without having to go in there and manually delete faces or manually paint them or sculpt them. And again, you could, if you wanted to, you could go in here and say, actually, you know what, maybe we want to make this a bit more detailed, and you can manually sculpt this area as well. That's totally fine. And sometimes you might have to do that, but at least we get a quick way of dealing with everything and adding more detail everywhere, and then we can focus on isolated areas if we really want to do some manual work on some areas as well. But if you've liked this video and you found this useful, make sure to like, subscribe, press that bell button to be notified about the next video. And if you're part of the Patreon, which is down in the description, you also have access to the PDF for this video as well, which goes over all the steps and has a little bit of a write-up on kind of what those steps are doing, and just again adding a little bit more detail for if you want to review what we've done in this video.